Welcome to another Hyperstition broadcast, another investigation into the technology and science that is shaping the future. Today's topic is awesome. It is electrostatic inertial confinement fusion. So my background is I actually used to work in fusion as an engineer. I worked on stellarators, and before that, a less conventional type of fusion device they called magnetized target fusion. And fusion is interesting because it is the potential to be the future source of energy for humanity forever. Basically, the fusion fuel elements are the most common elements in the universe. It's just hard to make it work, right? And pretty much everyone in the fusion industry approaches it in the same way, which is that we need to make a plasma extremely hot, and that means the whole plasma, means the ions and the electrons, but it's only the ions that do the fusing. And there's very few companies actually working to make the ions hotter than the electrons, which seems like it would be obvious, but it's easier to model, it's easier to control. The more conventionally, what you call thermalized plasma, which is magnetized fusion and magnetic confinement fusion and that kind of stuff. So today joining me is Robin Langtree, CEO and founder of Avalanche Fusion. Here he is. Robin, thanks so much for joining me, man. It's good to see you again.
Great to see you too. How's it going?
Yeah, it's going well. It's going great. Cool. Well, we're live here, so we're live, and this is a cool graphic. This is Avalanche Fusion with what looks like a space car.
Yeah, so this was actually the original render from our Defense Innovation Unit contract for what was it called? Nuclear Advanced Power and Propulsion. So it's supposed to be like a super maneuverable spacecraft for cislunar space. And so what you have is a tiny little Orbitron fusion machine on the nose, and then it's on a boom to keep the radiation away from the spacecraft, and then it's got radiators in the middle, and then a Hall thruster powering that thing around with some fuel and stuff. So this was like probably one of the first spacecrafts we ever designed at Avalanche, like way back in like, I guess it was like 2022 or something like that. So it's
That's
just
cool.
a really cool render that I still use every now and then.
Yeah. And I mean, your background actually coming, I think, is atypical in the fusion industry. You actually came from aerospace, isn't that right? You were at Blue Origin for a while.
Yeah, so I was at Blue Origin for 6 years. I was on the architecture team doing New Glenn. So basically writing Jeff Bezos like 6-page Amazon style memos on the architecture of New Glenn. I think my biggest claim to fame is like I wrote the 6-page memo that puts strakes and fins and stuff on the booster. Way before that was a really cool thing to do. And so that was like we had a lot of debate about the wisdom of doing that and putting aero features on a booster, but ultimately like it gives the rocket so much more performance and like capability to target the ship from like wind dispersions and atmospheric density dispersions that it totally trades its way on, even though it's like some additional complexity. You end up having to do like way shorter decel reentry burns because of it. So it ends up saving a lot of fuel. So that was sort of what I was doing, circa 2015, 2018, got into the wind tunnel, and it totally fixed a lot of the aerodynamic challenges of that, wacky base flare that kind of New Glenn has that covers the engines because the tank diameter sort of is a lot shorter. So yeah, that was like an awesome 6 years of my life just working on that New Glenn program. It was super exciting to see it land on like the first real try when the engines actually relit on the second flight, a couple weeks ago. That was amazing to see. So yeah, super excited to see that and really cheering for that team. New Glenn is going to be an amazing rocket engine as it kind of comes into full capability.
Yeah. So I think your technical background was in this kind of turbulence modeling area, right? And that was as applied to aerospace, but that kind of has some tie into like what you're now doing with Avalanche Fusion too, right? I mean, it's a similar kind of like simulations, numerical methods.
Yeah, it does. And so, I did my master's and my PhD on turbulence modeling, specifically laminar turbulent transitions. So trying to predict how flows go from being nice and smooth and laminar to turbulent, or how they sort of relaminarize, go from turbulent back to laminar. And, you know, we started doing simulations of that stuff on computers and like supercomputers and stuff. And then it turns out like a lot of those physics carry over to like reusable rockets, like rockets flying backwards, like has a lot of turbulent flow challenges and stuff. And so that I never would have imagined that that's where I would end up. Like I've always wanted to work on reusable rocketry, but I didn't realize that, you know, doing turbulence modeling would be like a path to writing 6-page memos at the architecture team at New Glenn. Like that was not an obvious transition for me. So I just feel really, really fortunate that I got a chance to kind of go do that. And then you're right, it is super relevant to fusion because, you know, what we're trying to build at Avalanche Energy is small compact fusion. So something you could launch into space. And it turns out the size of your fusion machine is really tied to like how turbulent your plasma is, because essentially you have all your particles diffusing to the walls, and then the rate they do that is a function of the size of the machine but also the turbulence. And so if you can come up with a fusion configuration that kills the turbulence, the rate that you get that diffusion to the walls drops, and so your machine can actually be smaller in terms of diameter. So yeah, killing turbulence in fusion turns out to be sort of like my second act and something I'm really, really focused on, because that's the enabler to make small compact fusion machines.
Yeah. And that's, I mean, fusion plasmas have these very weird properties where thermal conductivity along the magnetic field lines is like extremely high. And it's because the particles are charged. They want to spiral around those field lines, and so this thermal transport problem of like you're pumping all this energy into the plasma, so it gets super hot. How do you keep it hot? It really is, and that's the conventional view is like we have to trap it with these magnetic field lines that are essentially a closed flux surface that stays within the vessel, and so it's sort of like we think of turbulence as just like fluid, viscous, like Rayleigh vortex shedding or something like that. But like the turbulence in a plasma is like way worse because you have like electromagnetic self interactions, and there's like
it's way more complicated. Because normally turbulence is driven by, you know, shear, and it's interesting. Like shear produces turbulence. Like the turbulence source term in a turbulence equation is basically shear times viscosity. But also certain kinds of shear can kill turbulence. And so, you know, one of the things I worked on in my PhD was like the turbulence models are really dumb, right? They only think shear creates turbulence. They don't actually have knowledge about how certain kinds of shear and rotation can kill turbulence. And so that's one of the things we were trying to implement, was make the turbulence models smarter so that they could understand what kind of shears create turbulence, but also which kind of shears kill the turbulence and relaminarize it, like in a vortex of a wing and stuff. But yeah, like at a fundamental thing, like in fluids, shear it's all about shear and producing or killing turbulence. Whereas in plasmas, you have magnetic fields and electrostatic fields, and magnetic fields in particular operate sort of perpendicular cross product wise to the motion of the particles, and so that just makes it like all that much more complicated in a plasma than a fluid, for sure.
Yeah, totally. Well, let's dig in. I mean, this is really cool. I think you're working on a really cool kind of like I would frame it as like what's like the contrarian bet in fusion. Like it's kind of everyone's pursuing this stuff that's like, you know, most of the funding, I think, like historically, like 95% of public funding went into just tokamaks. And then if you look at like private funding, I think a lot of it has gone towards magnetic confinement more generally. I mean, CFS by like Commonwealth Fusion by itself has absorbed massive amounts, but I would bet like if there's like this, what is the contrarian bet on fusion, this thing that could upset everyone's expectations? I think it's electrostatic inertial confinement, because you're the whole goal is like, let's make the ions super hot. Let's have this non-thermal temperature distribution between ions and electrons. And that's my like simplistic framing, but let's kind of dig in. I mean, you know, if you like to, you have some slides you can kind of talk through here.
Sure, totally. Happy to share some slides and stuff. Yeah, I think I tweak the contrarian bet. I would say the contrarian bet is that the smallest form of fusion that allows you to iterate quickly and allows you to be really capital efficient is the contrarian bet. And then the question becomes, how do you go small? And so it turns out inertial electrostatic, or at least incorporating aspects of it, is a big unlock in terms of going small. It turns out the physics doesn't work for purely electrostatic fusion. Like, you have to have magnetic fields.
Yeah.
So really what we're talking about here is magneto-electrostatic fusion. And you're just sort of playing with the balance of electrostatic forces versus magnetic forces to try and shrink that fusion confinement plasma as small as you can and get it as hot as you can. And if you can do it small, you can iterate, you can be super capital efficient. You don't need to raise $1 billion. You can do it with tens of millions, is kind of what we're doing. Sort of the really exciting thing here. And you can do a lot of cool stuff with it. Like, tokamaks are cool. Fusion power plants are going to be awesome, but you're never going to be able to launch a tokamak into space.
Totally. Yes.
And if you can launch a magneto-electrostatic fusion machine into space and put, a megawatt, 5 megawatts of fusion power in orbit, you can do amazing things with that in terms of moving cargo around cislunar space to Mars, to the asteroids. So there's some really cool applications for compact fusion that you just can't do with a tokamak.
And you guys have, I think, had some kind of breakthroughs recently in developing the Orbitron and hitting these kinds of key milestones or key kind of plasma performance metrics.
Yeah, let's talk about it. So, I maybe will walk you back a little bit and do kind of a history of all these different approaches to fusion. So this is a really cool slide from. Can you guys see this? Okay, I think
it's showing up. Yeah.
Yeah. This is a really cool slide that Derek Sutherland, who was at ZAP and is now at Rialta Fusion doing magnetic mirrors, put together. It's sort of the taxonomy of all the different fusion approaches and how they're sort of related. And so, you've got pulsed operation, you've got continuous operation. You go down the pulse thing, you end up with laser fusion and all of the sort of different laser fusion companies. If you go down continuous operation, you end up with DT and PV11. And, the tokamaks and stellarators are sort of over here. The branch that we're on is sort of the magnetic mirror / inertial electrostatic. So there's a couple magnetic mirror companies or projects. Rialta Fusion is one, working on WAM. CMFX at Maryland is another one. And then the Russians actually had a very strong magnetic mirror program in the 70s and 80s. And some of those mirrors used aspects of electrostatics to heat them. And so that's very much what we're attempting to do, along with sort of CMFX and the Russians, was have the electrostatic force be roughly comparable to the magnetic field force, and use that to confine and heat the plasma. And the advantage of doing that is those devices actually can shrink to be very, very small. It turns out the other amazing thing you can do is kill turbulence in these devices, which reduces the diffusion to the walls and makes them even smaller. So that's sort of the branch we're on compared to everybody else, is this sort of magneto-electrostatic mirror approach to fusion, which is very niche, but super, super cool the more you learn about these devices. And we'll kind of get into that today.
Just a question for you then, electrostatic heating. I mean, you might interpret that as so for context, tokamaks, they inject fuel via a neutral particle beam, but people realize that particle beam can also add a lot of heating energy. And it's this beam-driven heating has led to this new regime of operation for tokamaks. I think they call it H mode. It's better confinement properties. It's it's this kind of inflection point. And I think also Tri-Alpha Energy has a similar beam-driven hybrid concept. But when you say electrostatic heating, is that similar to this beam-driven concept where it's I'm basically firing a particle beam in, or is it kind of more like a polywell where there's a surrounding electric field that stuff falls into?
It's different. So all these approaches need some way to heat the plasma. And so when you're shooting a neutral beam in, you're basically relying on the interaction of those neutral particles with the plasma to slow down and transfer their energy to the plasma. It's super ironic to me that tokamaks are getting into like neutral beam driven heating, because that's a very non-Maxwellian way to heat your plasma. And normally it's been the tokamak folks that have been like, Maxwellian thermal plasmas are the only way to do fusion, and if you deviate at all from thermal Maxwellian plasma, like, your losses will be too high. That's sort of like the root of the Ryder thesis argument. And so it is very curious that when they tried non-thermal, non-Maxwellian plasmas at tokamaks, they discovered, oh wow, there's like more performance here than we expected. The disadvantage, I would say, of using neutral beams is it takes a certain distance for that beam to slow down in your plasma, and so it sort of puts a lower limit on how small your fusion machine can be. And it turns out to be quite large, right? So you're talking multiple meters in diameter for your fusion machine to have enough distance for that neutral beam to slow down, which is kind of a disadvantage. The other reason is it's only sort of at most 50% efficient in terms of like power that went into the neutral beam versus actual power that goes into the plasma. The very, very cool thing about electrostatic fusion is that it's like 90 to 100% efficient in terms of all the power you put into biasing that electrode goes into heating the plasma. And it doesn't have like a size limitation, right? You can electrostatically heat plasmas that are very small. You can heat plasmas that are very large. Like it doesn't induce a minimum size constraint like a neutral beam does. And so electrostatic fusion is super interesting if you want compact, efficient fusion, because it's so efficient at heating the plasma.
Interesting. Yeah. Awesome. Well, let's keep going. Let's dig more. Let's dig more into this. I mean, this is great context.
Yeah. So, we're like, so here's where we are. We're like on the branch of magnetic mirrors and inertial electrostatic fusion. Yeah. And so like, if we kind of go a level deeper, here's how to think about what we're doing. So, these magneto-electrostatic fusion machines, the way they kind of work is they have a rod in the middle called a cathode that's biased to negative voltage, sometimes hundreds of kilovolts negative, and then they have a grounded shell around them called an anode. That's normally the vacuum vessel. And really what we're talking about here is the ratio of electrostatic force on the plasma versus magnetic force. So on the left here, this would be mostly electrostatic. So the ions are blue, and they're doing these like really big elliptical orbits, almost like the size of the device. And then the electrons are in red, and they're kind of confined, what are called E cross B magnetron orbits. And they're doing these sort of like loop-de-loops as they rotate around. This whole plasma is spinning. So it would be like rotating, like how my cursor is going like this. And then as you increase the magnetic field strength, holding the voltage constant, you start to magnetize the ions more. So the ion orbits start to shrink as a relative size to your full device size. And also your electron orbits get tighter. And then if you go all the way over to the right, you end up with what's called a centrifugal mirror, where both your ions and your electrons are strongly magnetized. They're doing these what are called E cross B cycloidal orbits. And so when we started Avalanche, we started off saying, okay, we want to go mostly electrostatic, very weak magnetic fields, and really just go for the most efficient electrostatic heating and confinement we can. And it turns out this configuration is unstable. And so what happens is the ions will clump together, and you'll get this rotating clump of ions. And that's very, very lossy in terms of losing ions to the wall. So it really limits the plasma density you can achieve. And so the big breakthrough that we had this summer was like, okay, let's like learn some things from the Russian mirror program. Let's go more to the right, where we magnetize the ions a little bit more, so up the magnetic fields relative to electrostatic. And then let's pulse this cathode with a high voltage high current pulse and really spin up that plasma and use rotational shear to stabilize the plasma against these instabilities. And so that was sort of like, the pivot. It's hard. I don't really like to call it a pivot, because at the end of the day, the device geometrically looks the same. It has a cathode, it has an anode. We're just kind of going deeper into like the physics and being like, oh, okay, like this is a better way to operate versus this. And if we start the plasma this way, we can spin it up really quickly and kill the instabilities. And so this was, we kind of filmed a YouTube video of this machine, Jin, coming together. You can see a picture of it here. So this is the Jin fusion machine. And it uses this rotational shear stabilization to kill the charges. So go ahead.
Sorry, rotate like 5 centimeters to your right.
Oh, sorry.
There you go. Perfect.
Yeah, there you go. So basically what we do is we've got this 12 centimeter diameter plasma core. We fill it with neutral gas. We charge up these capacitors, which are these white boxes here in the picture. And then we pulse the cathode. And when you do that, you get this high current in the radial direction, JR, crossed with the magnetic field in and out of the page, BZ. So if you do your like high school,
I'm doing it right now in my head.
You end up with like an F theta force in the azimuthal direction. And that spins up the plasma really, really quickly, generates shear, and that shear kills the instability and the turbulence, and you end up with this laminar quiescent plasma that's really, really well confined and centrifugally confined. And when we did that this summer, we blew past sort of all of our milestones for plasma density for this approach. So we were trying to hit 10 to the 11 per centimeter cubed, and we got up into the 12s.
So I think in tokamak accelerator world, they call this bootstrap current. Is that right? Like where they're driving this azimuthal current through some kind of ramp. And I know that
they don't have a cathode, so I'm not sure. Yeah. I'm not sure it's driven by a JR, but definitely what I think they're also seeing in tokamak accelerator land is rotation and rotational shear can be helpful for killing turbulence and stabilities. Like the physics is the same.
I know for Zap, that's Zap Energy is kind of their motto is shear flow stabilize Z pinch, right? And that's
thing, So what Zap is doing is they're shearing the flow axially. So they basically set up an axial shear and then run a lightning bolt through this axial shear. And the stronger they shear their plasma or their neutral gas, the higher they can kind of climb the triple product before these Z pitches go unstable. And so we're basically borrowing some of these ideas. It's just our shear is now radial instead of axial. But at the end of the day, it's shear to kill instabilities and turbulence. And that's sort of, the more you shear it, the more quiescent your plasma is, the higher you can sort of push these plasmas in terms of density and temperature before they go unstable. That's the name of the game here.
Right. So this is the your central cathode is establishing the electrostatic potential well that all these particles are orbiting in, and that makes it the orbitron. But you're saying now also that spiking current through that cathode that establishes the potential well now induces this net rotation around to get this kind of shear flow, or the flow itself is what produces the shear. I mean, shear is a velocity gradient over space, right?
Yeah. So you're spinning it up in a way that the velocity in the middle is rotating faster than the velocity of the edges. And so you end up with this like parabolic velocity profile, and that shear stretches, like let's say you had a turbulent eddy, that shear, that the different rotational speeds will stretch that eddy to the point where it can't maintain itself or make new eddies, and it'll basically go laminar. And it's super cool physics. This is what happens on very strong vortices on like wingtips. You've ever been flying and you see like this really smooth vortex come off like the flap of the 737. there's some physics, similar physics there, where the shear is killing the turbulence and causing that vortex to last a really long time. And so that was like the big breakthrough we had this summer, was figuring out this rotational shear stabilization. And so then the next problem we had was like, okay, how do we like get to really high rotational speeds and really, really high voltages? And so that's what we've been working on in the fall. Let me see if I got a good picture. Yeah, here's a good picture. So this is like maybe a bit of a history lesson. So, we're not the first fusion approach to try this, although I do think we are the smallest. This is the human for scale. And this is this one on the right is the Russian PSP2 machine at the Budapest Institute in the Soviet Union in I think it was in Siberia, Novosibirsk. And you can get a size for how big this thing was. This is like a really amazing machine in terms of the plasma densities it was able to get to, 10 to the 12 ions per centimeter cubed. The energies it was able to get to. I think their cathode was at like 350 kilovolts. And they were able to get to like really high ion energies. The reason we don't talk about this machine more often, or a lot of the US or Western fusion community doesn't know about it, is that the high voltage techniques they had at the time in the 70s and 80s, a lot of it used titanium for the electrodes. And as you know, like titanium absorbs hydrogen like nobody's business. And so during these shots where they would pulse the cathode, they would get all kinds of hydrogen outgassing from these titanium electrodes. And that would cause charge exchange with the plasma. And so those ions were leaving the plasma at like a huge rate. And so confinement time was really poor, like 100 microseconds, which, compared to like Zap or Z-pinch is an eternity, but for a steady state magneto-electrostatic machine, like you want almost seconds of confinement time, right? And so 100 microseconds is really bad. And so at the end of the day, when you roll up their triple product, it's not impressive because their confinement time was so poor from charge exchange. But their density and their ion energy was amazing. And so if you could just solve the outgassing of hydrogen from those electrodes, you would have an amazing fusion machine, right? And so, the next group that kind of picked this up was the University of Maryland in the 2000s with their MCX machine. And they were able to operate at really high plasma densities. They did some really cool measurements showing shear stabilization of turbulence and really quiet plasma, which is awesome. The problem they had was they could never get their energy up above 30 EV, and they were limited by this effect called sieve, which is critical ionization velocity. So essentially, again, same problem. You got a lot of neutrals coming off your walls, and ionizing those neutrals and spinning up those neutrals requires a lot of power. And so, if power is VI, and you have a lot of current going into ionizing that plasma, then your voltage has to drop for the constant power if you're charging this thing from a capacitor bank or something. And so sieve is really the reason most mainstream fusion scientists don't consider magneto-electrostatic mirrors as a viable approach, is because there's just so much neutral gas coming out of the walls and limiting the voltage and the speed that you can, rotate this plasma at. And so that is sort of the first thing we ran into after we started, stabilizing our plasma was sieve. So we couldn't get our cathode voltage much above 2 kV until we started getting rid of a lot of the sources of our neutral gas. And so that was like sort of the big breakthrough that we had sort of end of November, December, or beginning of December, was we were able to get a really pure hydrogen plasma and really start spinning up our plasmas like what the Russians were able to do. So happy to dive in on that more, but that's like sort of the next big breakthrough was like, okay, we got a stable dense plasma. Now we're able to really heat the plasma. Now we're cooking with gas, if you will. Really pushing, these plasmas to thermonuclear conditions, but in very tiny plasma cores. Like we're still operating at 12 centimeter diameter. Give you an idea. Where is sort of back here, right? So this is the size of our GIN fusion machine that plasma density this summer. So it's quite small compared to the PSP2 and even the MCX machine. We are going to go build bigger fusion machines, but right now we're spending a lot of time learning at this small scale because it allows us to iterate really quickly.
Totally makes sense. And I mean, just on the fusion iteration front, like ITER is this project that's been going on for forever. It's like the Duke Nukem forever of fusion projects, right. Where it's like, oh no, we just one more improvement or something. I mean, I don't think that's even the issue. That's like an ongoing thing. But I think this is an interesting angle where you guys can build devices and figure this out and then iterate quickly to get a better azimuthal current for more shear flow stabilization, and then iterate again on this electrode design to get less off-gassing. But yeah, I'm curious, like, what is it too much in the secret sauce to kind of reveal how the outgassing problem was solved?
No, I'm happy to kind of dive into it because it's really cool science. So, so we got this very high plasma density measurement, in August. And we're looking at the voltage during those shots, and we're seeing it go from, we would charge the capacitor bank up to like 50 kilovolts. And as soon as we struck a plasma and got that density, that voltage would drop to like 2 kilovolts, and it would just hang out there at 2 kilovolts during the whole shot and never increase after that. And so it was like, okay, what's going on here? And so, these are like, this is data off the machine from a multiple shots. You can kind of see where the voltage shot is. And then this is a pressure measurement from the vacuum chamber. And so it's like, yeah, sure enough, like the pressure is spiking during these shots, which is exactly what happened, with the Russian PSP2 machine. It's exactly what happened with the MCX machine. So it's like, okay, like, you've discovered, you've solved one problem, plasma stability. And now you've uncovered like the next, whack-a-mole that you got to go kill. And so, we did a lot of iteration, basically iterating on the design of this machine week for week. So like we have the ability to go from like an idea on Monday, design the part, fabricate the part during the week, break vacuum on Friday, install it, pump down, bake out over the weekend. And then Monday we're testing again. Right. And so we just like basically looked at all the different potential sources of neutral gas during a shot and how we could modify the machine to improve that. And then basically made this burn down list of all these different design iterations we could do. Some of them worked, some of them didn't. But as we kind of swapped these things out, we made steady progress in terms of bringing down the magnitude of the pressure spike as we did these shots, right? And this is SpaceX, folks. Like this is how you iterate a rocket engine, and this is how you iterate a fusion machine. It's like you try. Go ahead.
I'm curious that like the off-gassing can be reduced by geometry changes. I'd be curious, like, you'd think it's a more of a metallurgy thing, but I guess it makes me think that the off-gassing is really driven by like the surface electric field strength or something like that. It's electrons being stripped off by the electric field. Like is that like the right mental model, or what is really driving, like, what is, if you want to like reduce the off-gassing on this cathode, what is the knob to twist, I guess?
Yeah, so it starts off as a detective process, right? It's like, okay, I see I have high pressure, but what's that pressure made out of? And so that's sort of the next level down, is you're like, okay, like what's causing this pressure spike? And so there's this really cool diagnostic called optical emission spectroscopy, which is basically looking at the light that comes off the plasma. And from the different wavelengths, you can kind of bin the light sources into like different elements, right? And so when we started looking at this, we're like, like here's H alpha hydrogen, like, okay, it's a hydrogen plasma, you would expect that. But look at this oxygen. Like, why is there oxygen in the plasma, right? The pressure when we did the shot was like 10 to the minus 9 torr. Where's the oxygen coming from? And then, look, molybdenum, right? The cathode that runs through the center that is made out of that gets the high voltage, high current is made out of molybdenum, and that is showing up in your plasma. So that's like the first detective clue is like, okay, there's oxygen, there's molybdenum, those should not be there. Where are they coming from? And so we started by swapping out different parts of the cathode with copper, and sure enough, we could localize the source of sputtering to the center, which is where you would expect it to be. Like there was worry that it was coming up here, like at the feed through or some flashover, but no, we were able to locate it that like it's coming from sputtering of the cathode in the middle. And then it turns out, every time you do a vacuum break, you end up with water absorbed onto the walls. And when you hit it with this high voltage, high gradient pulse, you actually desorb or rip out a lot of water. And then you ionize that water. And so that's the source of the hydrogen and the oxygen. But this thing was never really designed to confine oxygen well. So a lot of that oxygen ends up sputtering the cathode. And that's what's creating the molybdenum in the plasma. So it's like, oh, okay. Clearly, we need to move the plasma away from the walls. We need to improve our vacuum processes to minimize the amount of water that we get in every time we open it up. And so it's a process of iterating both on geometry and our vacuum processes.
Yeah, like experimental techniques.
To steadily drop the oxygen, and as we steadily drop the oxygen, we also steadily dropped the molybdenum until we ended up with a pure hydrogen plasma. And so this is sort of some shots over a couple weeks as we did that SpaceX style iteration on the machine. So initially we were stuck at 2 kilovolt cathode during a shot. You use OES, you look at what's in the plasma, and clearly there's a lot of oxygen, a lot of molybdenum, and then a little bit of hydrogen here. And then as you bring those impurities down, you see your voltage during the shot is going up, which means your plasma is spinning faster. And then, this was sort of middle of November, we'd gotten down to 9 kV with, a little bit of oxygen, a little bit of molybdenum, but mostly, but a lot of hydrogen here. And so it was really just this keep iterating, keep finding the sources of impurity, knock that down, to the point where this was the huge breakthrough we had in early December, is that we were able to completely eliminate all of the impurities, including molybdenum and oxygen, and have basically a pure hydrogen plasma during the shot. And we're able to hold this 40 kV during the whole shot as that plasma spins up and then slowly winds down. And so the wild thing here is okay, you're at 40 kV. This plasma is spinning at 1,600 kilometers per second. It's super well confined because the current, you can see there's initially some current draw to ionize the plasma, but then the current goes to almost nothing, milliamps. Oops.
And that's how you have such a high standoff voltage.
That's because you have such a high voltage and such a highly rotating spinning plasma that it's so stable that now you're likely getting up into these really long confinement times of hundreds of milliseconds and stuff as the shot winds down, right? So this is milliseconds on the x-axis, so it's sort of wild how long this plasma lasts compared to some of these pulsed approaches. So kind of reframing it just to kind of lock it in, but it's starting off electrostatic inertial confinement, you needed to have some turbulence suppression. That's the injection of these magnetic fields. But the pulse produces magnetic fields leads to off-gassing, which is contamination of the plasma. That's bad for lots of reasons, but it's simply high atomic number element impurities are going to suck up a lot of heat, but also any off-gassing acts like current. It's like current. And so for a constant power input, your voltage drops because your current goes up. And that's what you saw across the cathode. So it's a reduced voltage. So it means so interesting, you said this voltage is an indicator of how fast the plasma is spinning, or is that an indicator of
how hot the plasma is, or how do you go from it's this voltage to it's this rotational speed, I guess?
Yeah, so there's some really good like 1D or 0D models you can do that like basically like if you have this voltage gradient across the plasma and you have this magnetic field, you can go compute what the drift velocity would be. And then from the drift velocity and the Coulomb collisions from that plasma, you can go estimate what the temperature of that rotating plasma is. And so, think about this. We have 40 kilovolts, but over a very small distance, right? This is only 6 centimeters from the cathode to the anode. So we have a very high voltage gradient, E. And that means that we are rotating or spinning our plasma at super high velocity. And then those collisions, those high energy collisions, are turning into a high temperature. And so when we go use these 0D models and we come back to, ion temperature and fusion triple product, we can kind of estimate where we might be on this curve. And so, the way to read this is the ion temperature and log keV plotted on log of the x, and then the fusion triple product on the y. And so for folks that are listening, so fusion triple product is sort of this common metric that we use in fusion to evaluate where different fusion approaches are. It's really simple. It's just the ion temperature times the plasma density, which is 1 over meter cubed, times the confinement time in seconds. And you multiply those three things out, and that it gives you sort of a common number to compare all of these very different fusion approaches that are operating at very different densities and energies and confinement times. And so to kind of read the map here, so, NIF, the National Ignition Facility, that hit Q greater than 1, depending on how big you draw the box there on the plasma, is the critique.
This is like Q, just to qualify, that's like Q scientific. That's like how much laser power went into the Hall room chamber versus how much fusion energy was released. That was net positive, but it's not like all the power that went into lasers. That's, if you do the wall plug efficiency, it's like a Q of like 0.005 or something. It's It's a lot different than this energy generation. And I'll just furthermore to drive this point home. That was not even an energy research program. That's a weapons development program. And they're very open about that. They're very, this is the weapons lab. Like, this is a weapons lab. We signed the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. We don't test nuclear bombs anymore. We want to understand how to develop like thermonuclear explosives, Gen 4 nuclear bombs that don't need a fission primary. We'll develop a laser lab that just compresses deuterium tritium to fusion conditions. Still a breakthrough. Still, there's other laser inertial confinement companies doing for energy production, but that was not NIF. But anyway,
what they did do that was super impressive is they hit a very high ion temperature, like 10 keV, and they hit a very high fusion triple product in terms of energy times density times the effective energy confinement time of that plasma. They have hit a triple product that nobody else has been able to achieve so far. But we got a lot of folks that are working on this and nipping at their heels. And so I think the next major data point I would point to is the Alcator CMOD, which is a tokamak that was built at MIT in the 2000s. That established a lot of the scaling laws that CFS, Commonwealth Fusion Systems, is using to design Spark. And so Spark is coming together as we speak. They are installing magnets in Devens, Massachusetts. And, the hope is that thing will turn on in 2027 and it'll be able to demonstrate, ion temperatures of 20 keV and triple products near 10 to the 23, which will basically unlock the tokamak approach to fusion. The other interesting thing there is stellarators. Andrew, you worked on stellarators, so you're probably like much better expert on me than I am. But my understanding is Wendelstein is probably the farthest along, and it's somewhere here in the 3 keV, 2 to 3 keV temperature and 10 to the 20 triple product. But like you probably are much better expert at that than I am.
Not much of an expert. I engineer, humble design engineer, but like the contrast. I mean, the way to think about tokamaks versus stellarators is stellators can operate at steady state, so continuous mode operation. And that's a bit, so Wendelstein has I think they're not fully steady state continuous, but they can go for 17 minutes or something like that, which is pretty crazy. And the big reason with that is, so it's all about how do you confine the orbits of the plasma. Basically, any axisymmetric design that's magnetic confinement, the magnets are closer together on the inside than the outside, so you have a stronger magnetic field there, and still get a net drift velocity from the inside, just from a magnetic pressure perspective, on the inside to the outside. So to have things spend equal amounts of time on the outside and the inside, you want them to rotate around, you want them to spiral around, and so now you have to apply this rotational magnetic field to get that. Stellarators apply that rotational field using magnet design, so it's applied externally. Tokamaks apply that magnetic field by driving a current through the plasma itself in this ring, and so that's the cell field. And to produce that current, you need to have a ramping. You have the central solenoid that ramps up and then ramps down. So tokamaks are inherently a ramped or pulse power design, whereas stellarators can be. And then that's why I said earlier, this bootstrap current. This is how much current do you have traveling in the plasma itself via this induced current. So stellarators can operate with very low amounts of that circulating current. But that's kind of just, so I think some of that kind of applies to your same thinking through and having this plasma current that is, the plasma current that is rotating around helps to apply an additional confining force. In your case, though, it's not the induced magnetic field. It is the plasma flow shear, I guess, that produces this higher degree of thermal confinement in the radial direction. And I think my simplistic framing on that is just kind of in a plasma, thermal transport is the ions moving. It is not them it's not like in a material where it's they're bouncing against each other, neighbors, and they're all still. It's them moving, and so where the plasma moves is where the heat goes. And by having it rotate circularly around, it cannot travel outwards as much. Is that a very simple way of thinking about it?
Yeah, it's like you want to kill turbulence to reduce your radial diffusion.
Yeah.
To laminar, I think it's called Brzezinski diffusion.
Mm-hmm.
And then what's really interesting is the mirror, it's still a mirror, it still pinches, but it's spinning so fast that there are axial centrifugal forces that want to compress the plasma axially. And so that's really good for improving the loss rate of the ions through the mirror pinches, because you've got this other force that really wants to squish the plasma axially.
Oh, away from the central.
Yeah. So one of the problems with mirrors has always been losing ions through the throat of the mirrors, right? The mirrors are called lossy. And when you spin the plasma as fast as these, magneto-electrostatic mirrors are doing, you end up with additional centrifugal forces that want to squish the plasma axially, and that further reduces the axial losses. So it's kind of a twofer. You get rid of turbulence, but you also solve the axial confinement challenge. Mm-hmm. So it's really amazing physics that are going on with these machines. The more you go into them, the more you're man, this is a very cool approach to fusion that has a lot of benefits. So if we kind of complete the walk around here in terms of where other folks are. So I think the TAE and Helion are field reverse configurations, FRCs. Mm-hmm. They're taking radically different approaches. So FRCs, field reverse configurations, are cool because the field lines close onto themselves, so they don't have the same problem of mirrors where things are sort of leaking through the magnetic pitches. But FRCs are inherently unstable above a certain density. And unfortunately, you want to operate at those densities to make them useful power devices. So the way Helion solved that is they're okay, we're going to do pulsed. We're going to pulse at times that are less than the time it takes for the plasma to go unstable. and then we're going to recover all that energy from the plasma back into the coils, back into the capacitors, and then we're going to go again. And so they are implicitly like not solving the instability problem with FRCs by just making sure the shot is short enough that it doesn't have time to go unstable. Whereas what TAE did, which was amazing, and I don't know if they've gotten enough credit in the fusion community for what they did, is they figured out how to stabilize the FRC. Dr. Jesus Romero, who actually joined Avalanche last summer, was very closely involved with working with that team in terms of how do you stabilize the FRC using these neutral beams to spin up the plasma in such a way that the FRC didn't tumble or go unstable, if you will. And so they were able to basically make an FRC last as long as they had power to run the magnets and the neutral beams. And so that's actually like a pretty amazing achievement. And so TAE has been in the news recently, merging with the True Social stock.
Yeah, that was an interesting. Can we get a quick hot take on that? Because I saw this, I was like, "What is this? This is Donald Trump's media company is buying a fusion."
Yeah, it comes across as a very weird pairing until you go a level deeper. And so I thought about this, and it's actually a brilliant move. So essentially, they're using neutral beams to heat and stabilize their plasma, which means their machine has to be a certain size, right? And unfortunately, they're going to need like $1 billion to build a large stabilized FRC net energy machine. And I think, the CEO of TAE, Michael Bindebauer, was on CNN. I think he's made no secret that they needed $1 billion to really prove this approach to fusion can work at a greater than Q greater than 1. And so where are you going to get $1 billion from? Like, you could try and do it from VC, although I feel like, Commonwealth has done some really big rounds and Helion as well, but I don't know if there's the appetite for yet another $1 billion fusion company out there.
Yeah.
You could think about going public via SPAC, but like you only raise 200, 300 million at most with a SPAC. So that doesn't get you there. So what are you going to do? Like, you could do an IPO, but that's a really big IPO trying to raise $1 billion. And so I think when they looked at it, they're like, you know what? It's a lot easier to just merge with this company that has something like $1.5 billion of Bitcoin already. It's already valued at a couple $1 billion. You merge those two companies together. It's valued at, I think, 6 is what was reported, 6 billion. And then it can probably issue stock slowly and accumulate the hundreds of millions they need to eventually get to $1 billion and build this net energy FRC machine. So, from a standpoint of how do you go about getting the capital if you need $1 billion, this was probably one of the few routes that was open to them, and they seem to have pulled it off. So, kudos to them.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah, that was very unexpected on my list of things to expect to happen in the fusion world.
It surprised a lot of people.
Yeah, totally.
So that's the start on FRCs, and then we got Zap Energy, which is working on the Z pinch and slowly moving the needle forward. I think they might even be up at 3 kV and 3 E to the 18 triple product now. This might be a little bit out of date. I saw some announcements, some papers recently about that. And then we've got General Fusion, which is, I've kind of lost the ball on what General Fusion is doing. I think it's still magneto-inertial, but there's it's a Spheromag now. So I don't know, maybe you know more.
I interned there once. So they're interesting. Yeah, they've always been working. Their variety of plasma is a Spheromag. It always has been. And that's just for people listening. It's like a tokamak field, but you have these larger strength, what you call colloidal fields that wrap around the donut circumference. And Spheromags and FRCs are both cool because they're both what they should, in the ideal sense, they're both self-stabilizing. They have these mutually reinforcing magnetic fields. You have ones that are azimuthal that produces a colloidal field, and then you have a colloidal current that produces an azimuthal current. And because because current wants to flow along magnetic field lines, these two things can be self-reinforcing, and so that it's called a Taylor state. It's a cool thing, but it's basically like eigen functions of the curl operator. If you look at like how does the magnetic field get generated, it's like things that are self-consistent with that. So they've always been using SphereMax. Their whole thing was we want to produce a SphereMac and then launch it out of essentially a plasma railgun. It's a very cool thing. You'd appreciate this. It's called a Marshall gun, but you kind of puff some gas into this concentric cylindrical chamber, and there's a breakdown current across it. And because that current is flowing through the electrodes, there's a railgun effect where it accelerates down this thing. And they wanted to have two of these axisymmetric, whatever, or concentric shooting SphereMax at each other. And then they would also have this thing that's like compressive metal liquid liner that would like try to compress it from all sides at once. So that was like a very like creative kind of hybrid atypical approach. That was really, I think, just Michel Laberge's like, he's like a mad scientist. Yeah. I think there are some rumors that they might consider going public at some point too, and they've been in the Canadian fusion scene for a while. But
nice.
But yeah, that's sorry, that was a diversion. But okay, so I see where you guys are kind of on the triple product roadmap. I'm curious.
So so I I don't want to leave out one of my favorite ones also, which is a Rialto WAM. That's a mirror. It's more of a traditional mirror in that they spin the plasma to stabilize it, but they don't spin it up nearly as fast as what we're talking about doing here. The E cross B. So they do have these electrodes at the end outside of the mirror throats, and they bias those to like a couple kilovolts, and that causes rotation just enough to stabilize the mirror against flute interchange instabilities. And so I have lost the ball a little bit on where Rialto WAM is. Last time I checked, they were sort of like sub a KeV, around 10 to the 8 plasma, like very dense plasma, but not very hot plasma. And they were working on neutral beams or ECR or some way to kind of heat the plasma further. But this is where I think they are based on the last time I checked. And then which comes to us. So, around, middle of November, we had this problem with the neutral gas outgassing. We'd gotten some improvement in it up to maybe 9 kilovolts of cathode during a shot. You go do the math on like what's the rotational drift velocity of that plasma. It's pretty crazy. It's like 350 kilometers per second, about 0.7 keV. But that's the speed that the hydrogen is rotating. It's not the temperature. So you go do the 0D calcs on Coulomb collisions, and you come up with an estimate of temperature, and it's not very exciting. It's about 50 EV, right? But that has already exceeded what the Maryland MCX machine was able to do in the 2000s. And the DOE actually shut down eventually the funding to MCX because they weren't able to push the ion temperature past 30 EV or whatever. And so that's why a lot of mainstream fusion programs consider these electrostatic mirrors sort of a dead end, is because they couldn't solve the neutral gas outgassing and the sieve and get to a really high temperature. So, just keep in mind, this is like an illustration of the power of iteration and this approach that SpaceX uses so well. We got our first plasma in August 14th, shear stabilized, right? Over the course of 2 or 3 months, we were able to significantly improve the neutral gas and got to 9 kV, which is better than what MCX ever could do. And then a month, like not even like 2 weeks later, with some really key design changes, we were able to eliminate almost all the impurities and get our cathode voltage all the way up to 40 kV. And so you go do the 0D math on that. That's a rotational drift velocity of like 1,600 kilometers per second. Which is something like, it's a really high, I think it's like 10 or 12 keV or something crazy. And then you convert that to a temperature based on the Coulomb collisions. We may be at 2 keV already. And so you go do the math and convert that to a triple product, in terms of what the estimated confinement time is. We know what the density is already from a microwave interferometer. And that would put us up in the 10 to the 18s, like, near where ZAP is.
Mm-hmm.
So this thing is progressing really quickly. The next step for the team is to really go put all the diagnostics on the machine and go directly measure those plasma parameters using multiple different diagnostics that will confirm it. So, there's a way to measure ion temperature using optical emission spectroscopy. It's really cool science. It uses basically the fact that if an ion is moving towards you or away from you, there's a Doppler shift in the wavelength of the light, and you can measure that Doppler shift and figure out how fast that ion is moving. So we can basically measure the rotational speed. Like right now, we're estimating it based on the voltage and the magnetic field strength, but we're going to be able to directly measure what that rotational speed is from the Doppler shift. And then we're also going to be able to get temperature, because temperature is really just a bunch of ions at different energies, right? And so that what you'll see is what's called Doppler broadening. You'll see the wavelength will broaden as the plasma gets hotter and hotter. So we're going to go use OES to measure the shift and the broadening to get the ion drift velocity and temperature, combine that with the density from our microwave interferometer and the confinement time from the voltage and current traces, and we'll be able to roll up, a fusion triple product very soon. And then we're going to go use some other diagnostics to go measure the electron temperature, measure the ion temperature using completely different physics, and then ultimately neutrons. And if we're doing our job right, all of those things should give us a rough range of where we are in terms of ion temperature and triple product. Then we're going to get that all third-party peer reviewed and then publish that in the coming months. So I'm really excited. Yeah, it's huge. I'm really, really excited. It's super cool that we've been able to iterate on the machine and get it operating at its full conditions now. And now we're doing some really cool science in terms of, diagnostics and starting to write fusion papers and stuff like that.
Yeah. That's awesome. This is very exciting. I'm very excited for you guys. And to see, it is the speed of iteration here that you have, that you can actually, we're going to have all new results in a couple months, and then we'll tackle this next thing and then this next thing. It's not, we need to open a new mine to get enough rare earth, HTS tape to build half our device or something. This is right. Yeah. This is awesome. Well, I hope to have you back to share more on the progress goes. And if you have any kind of shout out to the audience, if you guys are looking to hire plasma physicists or looking for anything like that, just kind of.
We are. So we're we've been pretty tight with headcount. We're about 50 people for the past 2-3 years. Really, really tight team. Everyone's kind of. It's nice keeping it small because everyone has a lot of ownership and able to contribute in really huge ways. There's one individual doing all the OES measurements essentially, or setting up that diagnostic. And there's one person doing the interferometer, and so it's what's cool about being small is everyone gets a lot of ownership. But we are kind of getting to the point where we need to have multiple fusion machines on the go. We need people writing papers. We need people designing the next bigger machines. So we are going to start, posting some more jobs and hiring some more people. So now is a really good time to kind of consider us. There's a lot of really exciting stuff happening at Avalanche, both on the engineering and on the science side. So huge thanks for giving me this opportunity to kind of give you the latest and greatest what's going on here. And I'm really, really excited for 2026, 2027. I think people are going to be shocked at some of the progress that's being made in fusion, not just by us, but by everybody who's working on fusion. I think it's going to be really awesome.
Yeah. And I'm excited for you guys. It is the coolest intersection of hardcore engineering and physics in a startup environment, So I think I've had experiences in those kinds of federal lab environments where you work on really cool stuff, but it's bureaucratic, it's slow. But back then, the startups were photo sharing apps and stuff. But now there's startups like you guys that is no, this is hardcore engineering. This is the pushing physical frontier limits. And so, Yeah, we'll have to have you back soon when you have more cool stuff to share. And thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me. This was awesome. I love that you're starting to do these daily things, Andrew. It's quickly becoming like one of my favorite things.
We need it. Where do you get when you have a technical, like you guys have a technical breakthrough? That's awesome. But like, engineers, physicists would be into that. Everybody, of course, fundraising announcements are exciting, but this is great. So I appreciate you coming. So we'll talk again soon.
All right. Thank you so much. Take care.
All right. See ya. Well. Whoa. Okay, cool. Well, that was another Hyperstition broadcast. A broadcast from the future. Future is going to be awesome and probably cooler than anyone guesses. So, Robin's a good friend. He was an early supporter of Deep Tech Week. Deep Tech Week, but he's based in Seattle. So Deep Tech Week is going to come to Seattle this year, I think in June, because there's a lot of cool fusion, a lot of cool aerospace, a lot of big manufacturing that's built up around the kind of Boeing ecosystem and adjacent places. And we're going to do more of these. So tomorrow I have another guest. Tomorrow's an internet friend, actually, Richard Bahil. I might be mispronouncing that, but Richard has been producing a large series of awesome YouTube explainers around fundamental physics, mathematical physics. So Richard and I are going to do a deep dive into quantum mechanics, into Bell's theorem around the mathematical limits constraining like hidden deterministic theories of quantum mechanics. And it gets into spooky stuff. It's like, does reality only exist when you look at it? I mean, it's really interesting stuff. But Richard is an expert in these things, and he's also a brilliant science communicator. So we'll be back tomorrow at 1 p.m. PST. And Friday's talk is going to be a great segue from what Richard has to present, because it's going to be about life, the nature of the universe, consciousness, physical reality. It's going to be great. So come back tomorrow at 1 p.m.